And now for this spot, I think we need the appropriate scenery. Thanks, computer.
My pleasure, sir.
Now, in this film, young Victor Frankenstein conducts a science experiment to bring his beloved dog Sparky back to life after being hit by a car, only to face the monstrous consequences when several of his classmates try to recreate his experiment. Now, believe it or not, this movie is actually a stop-motion remake to one of Tim Burton's own movies. You see, during the 1980s, while working for the Walt Disney Company, Tim Burton did animation for Vixie in The Fox and the Hound, along with the 1982 Tron movie, The Horned King, and conceptual art for The Black Cauldron. After he directed the stop-motion animated short Vincent, Tim made a live-action short of Frankenweenie in 1984. Unfortunately, after it was completed, Tim Burton was fired because Disney thought it was a waste of company resources. Thankfully, one person who was able to see it was Paul Rubens, who loved it and hired Burton to direct Pee-wee's Big Adventure, which launched Tim Burton's successful career as a live-action filmmaker. But over the years, he still longed to make a full-length stop-motion version of Frankenweenie. And finally, he got his chance when Disney asked him to direct Alice in Wonderland, and he accepted, on the condition that he could then make Frankenweenie. Anyway, when I heard about this stop-motion remake during early 2012, not just from the Disney websites, but also from Animat, I was absolutely interested, and I knew I had to give the original live-action short a watch from my Nightmare Before Christmas DVD before I saw it in theaters. And after doing so with my late grandmother, I really loved it. And to be honest, it's got to be one of my favorite animated films of 2012, up there with Illumination's The Lorax, DreamWorks' Rise of the Guardians, and of course, Disney's Wreck-It Ralph, along with two other Halloween animated films that were released during the exact same year, which were Paranorman and Hotel Transylvania. Movie fan, Jonathan, what are your thoughts on this movie?
I think it's a good movie. The characters are great, and, Victor Frankenstein is very relatable in this one, because we've all been there. We all wish we could bring our beloved pets back. And I'll be honest, guys, I did not know that this was actually a remake. And since we're on that subject, I gotta say this for the sake of argument. They fired Tim Burton, but he got the last laugh because they wanted him back. So, points to him big time.
In my opinion, after rewatching it a few times, I say that not only that this film is one of the best that Tim Burton ever made, but also one of the best remakes, and I enjoy it.
Now, from my perspective, not only does it play out similarly to how the original live-action short did, but I think the stop motion is fantastic. And there are times where it can be pretty smooth at times. Also, by looking at the town of New Holland, it kind of makes me think of Edward Scissorhands, mainly due to the neighborhood that the Frankenstein family live in.
It does look a lot like the town that Edward Scissorhands lived in. I mean, it's just a very simple suburb, so, yeah.
I agree that this town in this film does look similar to the one in Edward Scissorhands. And like Tim Burton's other film, Corpse Bride, I love the animation in this film, especially that it was shot in black and white.
Plus, I think the main character, Victor Frankenstein, is not only a bright and intelligent kid, but he's also reminiscent to Tim Burton himself, due to him being an outcast in his own world, creating little homemade movies, and watching classic monster flicks on TV and at the movie theater. Kind of like my close friend, Slasher Films Inc. founder, Justin Bernardhead. And I think Sparky is a sweet, friendly, and a brave dog.
Oh, I agree with you there, Joshua, because Victor Frankenstein does feel like Tim Burton. And it was Ray Harryhausen who said it best, that when you're doing stop-motion animation, you always put a little bit of yourself into your work. That's how you make your characters come to life.
Not only that I agree that Victor Frankenstein kind of reminds us of Tim Burton, but also to let you know that he kind of looks like Victor Van Dort from Corpse Bride, mainly because of the design of the character. Same thing for Victor's father, kinda. And on the topic of that film, Victor's mother kinda looks similar to Victoria, and the town's mayor, Mr. Burgermeister, looks kinda like Victoria's father.
Also, like Mars Attacks, which pays homage to classic sci-fi films, Frankenweenie is one big homage to classic monster films.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, the title Frankenweenie speaks for itself. Obviously, it was taken from Frankenstein, especially since that's our character's name, Victor Frankenstein. But it also pays homage to one legendary, iconic actor, and that would be the master of horror, Vincent Price. If you take a good look at the teacher, Mr. Shkrosky, you could tell his design was clearly based off of Vincent Price.
I agree. Victor's science teacher kind of looks similar to Tim Burton's old friend and inspiration Vincent Price. And I say that Martin Landau made an excellent performance, right next to his Academy Award-winning role as Bela Lugosi in Ed Wood. Also, the rest of the cast did a great job as the voices of the characters. Charlie Tahan, Frank Welker, Atticus Schaffer, Martin Short, Catherine O'Hara, and Winona Ryder. Also to let you know that what I like about it is that while the first act of the story is like the short film, the second act from when Victor did his experiment the second time all the way up to when few of the students from his science class studied and trying to recreate his experiment, it is a taste of what's to come. And once we get to the third act, it becomes a monster mash. And I understand that not only that it stayed true to the short film, with a few additions and updates, but also it's an homage to classic monster horror films. Not just Frankenstein, but also Dracula, the Wolfman, the Mummy, the Invisible Man, the Bride of Frankenstein, Gremlins, and even Japanese monster movies such as Godzilla and Gamera. Also to let you know that in the scene when Victor's parents were watching TV, well, they were watching the film of Horror of Dracula starring Christopher Lee. Isn't it interesting or what?
By the way, there's one scene in this movie that I kind of find a bit annoying nowadays, which happens to take place during the town meeting scene.
Apparently, Pluto isn't good enough to be a planet anymore.
You see, every time I hear that, I always counterattack by saying Pluto will always be a planet in my eyes ever since my childhood. And, movie fan, believe you me, I originally wanted to say that in the Schoolhouse Rock countdown, but unfortunately I couldn't because you, me, Bonnie, and Alpha couldn't find a place to add Interplanet Janet into the list.
Yeah, I wish we could have found a spot for it because the truth is, I'm with you. Because I don't buy into that whole thing that Pluto's not a planet. The reason they say it's not a planet anymore is because it's too small to be a planet. These scientists, I swear to God. If anything, they should take a lesson from Frank the Pug from the movie MIB. He said this.
You humans, when are you gonna learn that size doesn't matter?
And that's exactly right.
I would like to say that it is ridiculous to hear about Pluto not being a planet, because it is a planet. And I definitely agree. Size doesn't matter.
Anyway, back to Frankenweenie. Another thing that I want to mention is that during the Halloween season of 2012 at Disneyland, I managed to find Sparky's grave at the pet cemetery in front of the Haunted Mansion, which I thought was a really clever addition.
I never been there, but I totally agree. That is a clever addition. It's very befitting.
I agree. And I think it's great that they add Sparky's tombstone in the Haunted Mansion holiday after seeing that moment on YouTube. Though I think it would have been a lot perfect if Sparky's tombstone could have been right next to Zero's.
But sadly, the grave has not been added back during the years afterwards. And I find that to be very disappointing. Fan, Jonathan, is there anything else you'd like to add to this spot?
Just this, Joshua. I totally agree with you. They should bring it back.
I would like to say the same thing, that they should bring it back. And if they do, I hope they'll put it back right next to Zero's tombstone. So with all that said, if you haven't seen the stop-motion animated movie of Frankenweenie, check this movie out. But I suggest you watch it after watching the 1984 short film. Also, be sure to watch the follow-up short film of Captain Sparky vs. the Flying Saucers. I can assure you that you'll have a great time with these films.
Frankenweenie, a Tim Burton story resurrected from the dead.
I need your help.
I asked him first.
My problem bigger.
Yeah, he's right.
So, now that we got Frankenweenie out of the way, let's move on to another Frankenstein-styled movie. And this monster happens to have scissors for hands. Now, this film is a modern-day gothic fantasy which tells the story of Edward Scissorhands, a man created by an inventor who sadly died before finishing him and left him with scissors where he should have hands. One day, when the local Avon representative, Peg Boggs, calls at the historic mansion where he has been living all alone, she takes him back to her place to stay with her family. During Edward's stay, not only does he try to adapt to a new life and environment that he's not used to, but he also finds himself drawn to Peg's weary and sympathetic daughter Kim. Soon, Edward finds himself a local celebrity after the town realizes that his talents include creative hedge trimming and an unrivaled ability to cut hair. But, unfortunately, things then start to take a turn for the worse when Edward is accused of rape, breaking into somebody's house, and hurting people. Now, like with Mars Attacks, this is a film that I hope to blog someday. So, movie fan, Jonathan, I'd like you guys to share your thoughts on this first before I do.
I think it's a great movie. It's one of those out-of-the-box type of things, because even though the plot is very straightforward, it's very creative, very original, and most of the characters are very likable.
In my opinion, Edward Scissorhands is the best movie that Tim Burton has ever done. After watching it many times, while it is a Frankenstein story, I can also tell that this is a Beauty and the Beast story, even that the animated version from Disney came in a year after this movie.
As for what I think, well, I find this to be another classic Tim Burton film, and I'd like to thank my former high school math teacher, Jackie Ochoa, for introducing me to it. And I'm also surprised that this is one of several films that were released during the very year I was born, 1990. In my opinion, I like that the whole movie is a bedtime story told by Kim Boggs as a grandmother. I think the suburban neighborhood in this movie is nicely set, and it seems like a fine place to live, even if some of the residents can be a bit uncomfortable around folks who are different. And the mansion where Edward was created is pretty spooky on the inside, but it is nice on the outside due to the hedges being trimmed and shaped very creatively.
Once again, Tim Burton is showing his genius. Because like you said, Joshua, the neighborhood and the house, they're great.
I love the sets, mostly the mansion where Edward lives, including the garden. I especially love the use of German expressionism inside the mansion. I also like the suburban neighborhood due to how bright and colorful the houses are.
Plus, as a person who's in the autistic/neurodivergent group, I find the story to be very relatable, since it does reflect Tim Burton's feelings of isolation and being unable to communicate with people around him.
Well, I can actually relate to that because I've always been a loner my whole life, so I can relate.
I definitely agree. I mean, Tim Burton is also known for making the main characters as either sympathetic, isolated, or outcasts, and Edward is the best example.
Also, I think Edward is a very creative and sympathetic character, and I find it very interesting that this was Johnny Depp's first film with Tim Burton.
There's no doubt that Edward is a very sympathetic character, and I think that's what makes this story work the most, because, well, like you said earlier, it's kind of like a Frankenstein story, but with a twist. He's not a monster. Not really. He may look like one, but he's really misunderstood just because of the way he looks and because of those scissors he's got for hands. And that's what makes him extremely likable.
I say that Edward is a sympathetic and a misunderstood character, especially when he has scissors for hands. He may look different, but he does have a good heart. I also like his creativity, rather it be hedge trims, haircuts for both dogs and humans, and ice sculptures. Which I could say that not only that Edward is likable, but also those things he did with his scissor hands, that's what makes him special. As Peg said,
no matter what, Edward will always be special.
Well said.
As for the other characters, Kim is a sweet and caring teenage girl. Her parents, Peg and Bill, are nice and friendly people, and their young son, Kevin, seems like a good BFF character for Edward.
I totally agree. And there's one character who definitely must be mentioned in this, and that would be Edward's creator, who is played by the legendary master of horror himself, Vincent Price. This was one of his final films, and a lot of people don't know this, but the producers, they tried to kick him out of the whole production. Yeah, because sadly, by this time, he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's, and, well, it was starting to catch up to him. And when they were trying to film with Vincent Price, unfortunately, because of his Parkinson's, they had to do a lot of reshoots. And because of that, it was costing the studio a lot of money to do all those reshoots, so the producers wanted to get rid of it. However, Tim Burton refused to go with that. He insisted on having Vincent Price and no one else. Which really shows how much respect Tim Burton really had for Vincent Price, because, you know, he really stood up for him on this one. And points to him for that.
That is very interesting, movie fan. And it's a good thing that Tim Burton came to the rescue, because he and Vincent Price were good friends. I say that this is Vincent Price's best performance, right next to his previous roles that he did before, such as House on Haunted Hill, The Tingler, The Great Mouse Detective, and narrating Michael Jackson's Thriller. So do the rest of the cast: Johnny Depp, Winona Ryder, Diane Wiest, Alan Arkin, and a few others.
However, there is one character in this movie that I really despised from the get-go, and that character is Kim's jerkish boyfriend, Jim. Not only due to his typical jealousy, but also due to him tricking Edward into breaking into his parents' house, accusing Edward for cutting Kim on purpose, which was in reality an accident, attacking Edward after he saved Kevin from almost getting run over, and threatening Edward to stay away from his girl. I mean, sheesh, what is up with hoodlums like him?
If I knew the answer to that, I'd write a book, Joshua. I really would.
I say that Jim is one of the biggest jerks in movie history, right next to Biff Tannen from the Back to the Future trilogy. And like I said, Edward Scissorhands is a Beauty and the Beast story. Like the 2004 movie of The Phantom of the Opera, It even kind of reminds me of Beauty and the Beast, because you got a love story where there's a spark between a beautiful girl and a man who looked different, while a handsome jerk tries to ruin his life so he can get what he wants. In fact, like Biff, Jim is like a high school version of Gaston.
Plus, ever since 2021, I was surprised that his actor, Anthony Michael Hall, grew up into Tommy Doyle in Halloween Kills. Another thing that I like in this movie is the Christmas settings and snowfall scenes, which feel very magical. And like another Tim Burton film that was released 3 years afterwards, I believe that this is a movie that folks can watch either during Halloween or the Christmas seasons.
I tend to lean more on Halloween with this picture, but I could see that.
I could say it's worth watching on Halloween. Also, I love the music score, and this is one of the absolute best music scores that Danny Elfman has ever done, especially the use of choir, including the beautifully made Ice Dance music piece. I especially love the special effects, when Edward Scissorhands were puppets, and it was created by the late legendary Stan Winston, who also did the makeup for turning Johnny Depp into Edward alongside Van Nell. When the film was released, it became very successful and received positive reviews. Also to let you know that Edward Scissorhands was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Makeup, but lost to Dick Tracy. So with all that said, if you haven't seen Edward Scissorhands, then we highly recommend you to check it out. You are gonna love it, because it is a masterpiece.
Edward Scissorhands, a film that cuts and snips its way to the number 4 spot. Now, I guess you guys never thought that I'd put Tim Burton's adaptation of the classic Caped Crusader of DC this high on the list, did ya? Yes, folks, we're now on to the majors. Having witnessed his parents' brutal murder as a child, millionaire philanthropist Bruce Wayne fights crime in Gotham City disguised as Batman, a costumed superhero who strikes fear into the hearts of villains. But when a deformed madman named Jack Napier, aka the Joker, seizes control of Gotham's criminal underworld, Batman must face his most ruthless nemesis ever while protecting both his identity and his love interest, reporter Vicky Vale. Now, believe me when I say that Batman is my all-time favorite superhero in the DC Comics library, and when I was a little kid, I've heard a lot of people my age talk about him, either at school or at daycare. Sadly, I never watched Tim Burton's Batman when I was little, though it wouldn't be until my high school through college ages where I would finally give it a watch, and I find it to be one of the best Batman films ever, up there with Mask of the Phantasm and the Dark Knight trilogy. Oh, and speaking of which, I find it both cool and interesting that the movie was one of the inspirations for Batman the Animated Series, along with Batmonk from Alvin the Chipmunks Go to the Movies.
For me, this movie has always been a classic when it comes to Batman. And it has been said multiple times from multiple viewers, and I'm no different on this one, that when Tim Burton did this, he really changed the game around. Because up until this point, all we really had was the 1960s Adam West version, or the Bright Knight, if you prefer, which I'm sure many will remember. It was rather corny, campy, silly at times, and everything happened during the daytime. Whereas for Tim Burton's Batman, everything is dark, dreary, and of course Batman's moments happen at night. And unlike the Adam West version, it was very serious. In fact, the minute everybody saw this, they fell in love with it. It's no lie. Because for many, it felt true to the comics. If anything, Tim Burton brought Batman back to his darker age, and that came out perfectly.
As we all know, that this movie was based on the series of comic books created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, and Tim Burton did a fantastic job for making this film. And you must know that while Spider-Man is my favorite superhero from Marvel, Batman is my favorite from DC Comics. And I gotta tell you that this movie is incredible. I love the story, the sets, the costumes, the makeup, the special effects, the music by Danny Elfman, and the songs by the late great singer Prince. Tim Burton is one of the best directors to adapt this character, right next to Christopher Nolan and Matt Reeves.
What I like about this film is the look of Gotham City, and I think Anton Furst did a remarkable job with designing it along with the Batmobile. So much so that he actually won the Academy Award for Best Art Direction.
Rightfully so, because the look is fantastic. And the Batmobile. Everybody knows that Batmobile. You could just take one glance at it, and you immediately know what it is. In fact, this version of the Batmobile is so iconic that when they made the animated series, they tried to incorporate the look of that Batmobile. Of course, they did make some changes, but on the basic outline, it's very similar.
I definitely agree that not only that the look of both Gotham City and the Batcave are very well detailed, but the design of both the Batmobile and the Batwing. And I say that the late great art director Anton Furst did an incredible job. And yes, he deserved that Oscar for Best Art Direction alongside set decorator Peter Young. Also to let you know that this version of the Batmobile is one of the most famous Batmobiles in DC Comics history, along with the animated series, the Kilmer-mobile, and the Tumbler.
Also, like with Beetlejuice, Michael Keaton was awesome when it comes to playing Batman. Plus, I think Vicky Vale is an underrated character, mostly because I don't remember seeing her in too many other Batman or DC films. And the Joker is not only a classical Batman villain, but he's also the most insane, psychotic, and terrifying ever. And I confess, I was one of several people who were terrified of this clown prince of crime as a kid.
Well, I would say it's rightfully so, Joshua, because I'll tell you this, Jack Nicholson playing the Joker, it was perfect, because he felt like the real Joker. Sure, everybody loves to say that Heath Ledger was the best Joker. Well, let's get real. Jack Nicholson is more accurate to the Joker's character, because anybody could just blow up a hospital. But this Joker, he gets balloons, fills them with nerve gas, and tries to poison the entire city. That's something the Joker would really try to do in the comics. Not just do the cliche, blow up a hospital bit.
I also enjoy the cast as well. Michael Keaton, who's absolutely incredible in this film as both Bruce Wayne and Batman, and Kim Basinger, who made a good performance as Vicky Vale. By the way, Joshua, the character of Vicky Vale did appear a few times, such as the animated film of The Batman vs. Dracula, one of the episodes of Batman the Brave and the Bold, and the Batman Arkham series video games. Also, Jack Nicholson, who I gotta say he stole the show as the Joker. In my opinion, he made a terrifying performance, right next to his previous role of Jack Torrance in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining from 1980. Other cast members including Pat Hingle, Michael Gogg, Billy D. Williams, Robert Wool, Tracy Walter, and Jack Palance.
Plus, while the movie was mostly shot at Pinewood Studios, I liked the other shooting locations like Nebworth House and Hatfield House, which were both used for Wayne Manor, along with Action Lane Power Station and Little Bartworth Power Station. The last thing I want to mention is that Tim Burton's Batman was followed by 3 movies, which were Batman Returns, which is also great, Batman Forever, which is underrated, and I like that it features my favorite comedian Jim Carrey as the Riddler, and of course, Batman and Robin, which I'm really sorry to say is a guilty pleasure for me.
What?
Yeah, I know it's a bad movie, and I understand that it was responsible for delaying Sub-Zero, but the truth is, Batman and Robin was the very first Batman movie that I ever watched, and I want to thank my friend Justin Bernardhead for recommending me to watch it on VHS back in the late 90s, and I was about 7 years old back then. Plus, that film features a man who wrote to me not long after I became an Eagle Scout during the time when he was in the California office. Movie fan, Jonathan, is there anything else you'd like to add regarding Tim Burton's Batman?
Just one more thing. Tim Burton's Batman is a true classic. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you do, because you're going to love it.
Well, before I saw this film, I was introduced to the character by watching Batman Forever, which I enjoyed for what it is, despite for a few nitpicks. There's not much to say except that, in my opinion, Batman is one of the absolute best movies that Tim Burton ever made. When it was released in 1989, it became a blockbuster hit, and as we mentioned before, it won an Oscar for Best Art Direction, and it totally deserved it. So if you are a Batman fan, then you'll enjoy this movie. Also, happy 35th anniversary to one of Tim Burton's absolute best films of all time, and happy 85th anniversary to The Dark Knight, who just got a star in the Hollywood Walk of Fame.
So, with all that said, Tim Burton's Batman truly strikes fear at number 3.
I'm Batman.
And now, for the number 2 spot and runner-up, let's go over Tim Burton's adaptation of Roald Dahl's famous book.
That's spooky.
Now, this film's story is very simple, but anyway, when Willy Wonka decides to allow 5 children to visit his chocolate factory, he decides to release 5 golden tickets in 5 separate chocolate bars. The kids who find the golden tickets will be taken on a tour of Wonka's chocolate factory and get a special glimpse of the wonders within. One of the lucky winners is a very special boy from a poor family named Charlie Bucket. Accompanied by his grandpa Joe, Charlie joins the rest of the children to experience the most amazing factory ever. Unfortunately, during the tour, 4 of the children get eliminated due to their character flaws until Charlie is the last kid left, resulting in him receiving the ultimate grand prize. Now, again, it's been about 10 years since I blogged this movie, and I'm really happy to be talking about it again, especially after blogging last year's Wonka movie and performing in the stage musical version with my friends from Musical Theater Village as both Grandpa George and an Oompa Loompa. Now, I understand that most folks prefer the 1971 version starring Gene Wilder over this one, but in all honesty, the reason why I prefer this version is mainly due to it mostly staying true to Roald Dahl's book. Plus, believe me, it's 10 times better than this.
I'll be honest, I am not a fan of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but yes, it is 10 times better than that Tom and Jerry version.
In my opinion, I gotta say that this is one of the best films. And yes, I say that not only that it stays true to the source material of the book, but it's also a lot better than this Tom and Jerry crossover, which I'm glad I didn't bother to watch this piece of garbage, thanks to the reviews I've seen from both Bonnie from Joy Unicycle, and of course the two-parter episode from The Hardcore Kid featuring Huey Toonmore.
Now, the thing that I like in this movie is mainly the story, which is not just simple, but also nostalgic, heartwarming, and pretty dark at times. But now that I think about it, I feel like Tim Burton and Roald Dahl do seem to have something in common. I mean, the witches and James and the Giant Peach have some darkness in those stories as well.
That's true. I never read James and the Giant Peach, but I have read The Witches. And yes, that does have some dark elements. And Tim Burton, he works with the macabre, so, yeah.
I remember reading the book of it before and after watching these two films back in my day, and I gotta say that Tim Burton did a good job of making this movie because of his dark and twisted imagination. Also, here's an interesting fact for you. Wild Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is the first time that he directed one of Roald Dahl's famous books, but also this is the second time that he worked on a movie adaptation of a Roald Dahl book, because in 1996 he was a producer of the live-action / stop-motion animated movie adaptation of James and the Giant Peach, while Henry Selick directed it. In my opinion, I love the movie. It stayed true to the source materials of the book with a few additions, which we'll get into that in a minute.
Plus, I think production designer Alex McDowell did a really great job with designing the film's sets, and I find it interesting that he described the visual authentic as a collision between psychedelic, inflatable pop art and 1960s Russian-American space race. In my opinion, I think Wonka's factory looks really amazing. From the chocolate room, to the invention room, to the nut sorting room, to the television room.
Yeah, those places do look very impressive. Once again, Tim Burton, he loves to do practical effects for his movies.
I agree. The sets are very well done. Especially that some of the sets took place in Pinewood Studios in London, which is the same place where they shoot one of Tim Burton's previous films, Batman. Also to let you know that the Chocolate Room was filmed in the James Bond soundstage. And interesting enough, the Chocolate River is made out of real chocolate.
Also, I like the several different flashback scenes which show the time when Grandpa Joe used to work for Willy Wonka at a candy shop, the grand opening of Wonka's chocolate factory, the part where Wonka builds a chocolate palace for Prince Pondicherry, the time when Wonka went to Loompa Land and met the Oompa Loompas, and of course, Wonka's childhood backstories.
I'll admit it does give a better explanation as to how Willy Wonka became Willy Wonka.
I say that the flashbacks for both Willy Wonka and Grandpa Joe are very interesting. Especially that Willy's father, Wilbur Wonka, happens to be a dentist. By the way, while Christopher Lee played this character, he at that time not only that he voiced Pastor Gallswells in Corpse Bride, but he also reprised his role of Count Dooku in Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith, which by the way, those movies were released in 2005. Very interesting, isn't it?
Plus, I think the interview scenes with the golden ticket winners really do show their character flaws, from gluttony, to pride, to spoiled, to avidiot. As for Willy Wonka himself, I think Johnny Depp does do a decent job, and due to his high-pitched voice, he sounded very unrecognizable to me. Plus, I think his personality is kind of like Dr. Seuss, Walt Disney, and Flint Lockwood, due to him having a wild little kid in him.
Yep, that describes him to a T.
That's very fascinating, Joshua. Also, the way he speaks, it kind of reminds me of one of his previous roles, Edward D. Wood Jr., in the movie of Ed Wood from 1994, due to the enthusiastic tone of voice. Well, at least Willy Wonka doesn't go like this.
Nobody will ever notice that. Filmmaking is not about the tiny details, it's about the big picture.
Anyway, in my opinion, Johnny Depp made a good performance. And you must know, this movie has such a really good cast, including those who played as the 5 Golden Ticket winning kids.
Plus, I think the Oompa Loompas are very interesting characters. Not just for their songs, which are in different styles and genres, but mainly due to them being played by one guy, Deep Roy. I mean, that's pretty difficult.
It sure is. Even though they did use digital technology to help multiply him, it's not easy.
Well, you must know that not only that they use digital technology for the Oompa Loompas, but also they use animatronics. Same thing for the squirrels in the nut room scene. And interesting enough, not only that they use both practical effects and digital technology for it, but they also use trained squirrels.
Also, even though he's not as important compared to Grandpa Joe, I think Grandpa George is a very underrated character in this movie, and I think he has some of the most memorable scenes in this film. Take this scene, for example.
Well, it's a good thing you're going to a chocolate factory, you ungrateful little
Lastly, I think Charlie Bucket is a really kind and creative kid. I like that he admires Willy Wonka. He shares a close bond with his parents and his grandparents, and I also like that he never gives up when trying to find a golden ticket.
Yeah, that's one of the best things about Charlie Bucket. He doesn't give up.
I agree, and I say that Freddie Highmore made a wonderful performance. And also you must know that this movie is the second time that he worked with Johnny Depp, because back in 2004, they worked on Mark Forrester's movie of Finding Neverland. Happy 20th anniversary, by the way. Also, I've got to talk about the music and the songs. The music is incredible, and Danny Elfman did a really good job. I also enjoyed the songs that were performed by the Oompa Loompas. And you must know that each of the songs that were performed by the Oompa Loompas in this film has the same rhymes that is written in the book. And I'm glad that they did that. If you love the book, then we highly recommend you to check out this film.
Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, a sweet movie to add to the number 2 spot.
Wow!
Now before we move on to the number 1 spot, movie fan Jonathan and I would like to share our own personal honorable mentions. Hey Jonathan, since you're new to my channel, how about you go first?
I'll be happy to, Joshua. My honorable mention goes to the 2014 movie of Big Eyes. The plot took place in the late 1950s and early 60s, where artist Margaret meets a man named Walter Keane, who later got married. Later in the film, Walter achieves unbelievable fame and success with portraits of big-eyed paintings. However, no one realizes that his wife Margaret is the real painter behind the brush. Although, Margaret is horrified to learn that Walter is passing off her work as his own. She is too meek to protest too loudly. It isn't until the Keane's marriage comes to an end, and a lawsuit follows that the truth finally comes to light. Now, I must let you know that this is one of the best movies that Tim Burton ever made. Just like he did with Ed Wood, Sleepy Hollow, and Dark Shadows, he did a good job with the cinematography, and he did an excellent job making it look like the late 1950s and early 60s. In my opinion, Tim Burton did a great job making this film. Also, the cast are great in their roles. Amy Adams, Christoph Waltz, Terrence Stamp, Jason Schwartzman, and a few others, including the legendary Margaret Keane in a cameo. Also to let you know that I think Margaret Keene's Big Eye paintings were one of the inspirations for the Powerpuff Girls. Also to let you know that on June 26, 2022, Margaret Keene passed away at the age of 94. She may be gone, but her artwork will never be forgotten. With all that said, if you haven't seen the movie of Big Eyes, I highly recommend it. Rest in peace, Margaret Keene. You are one of the great artists and we'll never forget you.
Awesome, Jonathan. Now it's your turn, fan.
My honorable mention is The Planet of the Apes. Now, I know this isn't his greatest work. In fact, it did bomb pretty badly in the box office because compared to the original, it lacked quite a bit. However, it is still worth mentioning because it does have a very impressive background. Because with Tim Burton, you always expect the backgrounds to be incredible. It looks magnificent. It's like a big jungle, but there's also a desert region, all kinds of things. And more importantly, the animatronics on the apes are incredible. They are way updated compared to what they did back in the 70s. Now, I know that's not quite fair, but it is the truth. And with Tim Burton, he paid some serious attention to detail with how he wanted the apes to look. They all look completely different, and they all look very true to their characters.
Nice. Well, I guess it's my turn now. When I was little, Walt Disney's Dumbo was one of my absolute favorite animated films, and I still love it to this very day. In fact, even though I didn't include it on my top 15 Disneyland attractions, I consider Dumbo the Flying Elephant as one of my personal childhood favorite rides. But then, during the late 2010s, when I heard that Tim Burton would be directing a live-action remake of Dumbo, I was pretty curious as to how it would be. And yes, I know a lot of you are not too fond of the live-action Disney remakes, kind of like how folks weren't always fond of the Disney Toon / Walt Disney Television Animation produced sequels from the early 1990s to the early 2000s. But that's a topic for another time. Anyway, when I saw the movie in theaters, it really surprised me. Firstly, I like how the movie takes Walt Disney's 1941 animated classic and expands it a bit. Secondly, I think Dumbo is still as adorable and sympathetic here as he is in animation. So much so that I really want to give the little fella a hug, since we outcasts must stick together. Also, I think his big ears, which give him the ability to fly, really makes him special. And I think he's very brave when he fights fire using water from his trunk. Thirdly, I think the children, Millie and Joe, are really sweet supporting characters while helping Dumbo become a circus star and reunite with his mother, Mrs. Jumbo. Plus, I think they've got to be the luckiest kids ever, due to them riding on Dumbo a couple times. And I think their dad, Holt, is another great character, even though he does sometimes struggle when it comes to connecting with his children. Most likely due to him suffering the loss of his wife and the fact that he lost his arm during his last war. Fourthly, I like the several different Easter eggs that reference the 1941 animated classic, like Casey Jr. the Circus Train, the Pink Elephant Bubble Show, and the part where Miss Atlantis sings Baby Mine, which is still one of the sweetest and tear-jerking songs in Disney history. Fifthly, I think Dreamland, owned by the villainous V.A. Vanderveer, seems like a breathtaking amusement park, and I find it interesting that it was inspired by Coney Island, while mixing in the power of knowledge, innovation, curiosity, and creativity. And lastly, like several other Tim Burton films, some of the cast members include a few actors whom Tim got to work with before, like Danny DeVito, whom was previously in Batman Returns, Mars Attacks, Big Fish, and just recently Beetlejuice, Michael Keaton, whom was in the 2 Batman films and the Beetlejuice films, Eva Green, whom was in Dark Shadows and Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, and the late Alan Arkin, whom was in Edward Scissorhands. Now, Tim Burton's Dumbo may have missed a spot on the list, but it really does deserve a mention. And trust me, if you still love Walt Disney's 1941 animated version like I do, then I'm sure you guys might enjoy this one as well. And after watching it, it'll really make you believe that an elephant can actually fly. So now we come to the number 1 spot, the final entry on this list of Tim Burton films. Now, I bet you're all wondering which it'll be. Well, the answer might be pretty obvious to most of you. Now, some of you may think that I'm cheating with this one since Tim Burton didn't actually direct it and he had Henry Selick as the director instead. But keep in mind, viewers, the title clearly says Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas, so that makes it an exception. Now, this movie follows the misadventures of Jack Skellington, Halloween's most beloved pumpkin king, who has become bored with the same annual routine of frightening people in the real world. When Jack accidentally stumbles onto Christmastown, he becomes so fascinated and obsessed that he plots to bring Christmas under his control by kidnapping Santa Claus and taking over the role. But Jack soon discovers that even the best laid plans of mice and skeleton men can go seriously awry. Now, to be quite honest, I never saw this movie in theaters back in 1993, but after watching it on both VHS and DVD during the early 2000s, this movie really blows my mind. In my opinion, like most folks out there, I think this is one of the best stop-motion films of all time, up there with Coraline, Chicken Run, and Kubo and the Two Strings. And it's got to be Tim Burton's magnum opus.
Oh, without a doubt, it is definitely his magnum opus. I would go so far as to say that it's his greatest of all time, and rightfully so, because there isn't a person around who has not at least heard of this movie. Because I remember watching it as a kid, and it blew my mind as well. It was incredible just to see these characters come to life on the screen. And at that time, I had no idea that it was stop-motion animation they were using. Because, well, I was a little too young at the time to realize it. But I fell in love with it instantly. And for the record, we are definitely not cheating on this one. Because like you said, Joshua, Tim Burton didn't direct it, but he did produce it, and he did create it. And he even helped with some of the work involved. Because as you could clearly see in these pictures, Tim Burton is working with Selick. And like I always say, contrary to popular belief, producers are the ones who really call the shots. Oh, I'm sure Tim Burton is the type of guy who would let Henry Selick do his thing, but it's obvious that Tim Burton helped out a little.
In my opinion, while Edward Scissorhands is my favorite movie from Tim Burton, this movie is my favorite stop-motion animated movie he ever made, despite that he produced it but not directed it. And here's a good reason why. At first, he wanted to direct The Nightmare Before Christmas, but due to schedule difficulties because Tim Burton was busy on directing Batman Returns. On the plus side, he gets to be producer of the film, while he hired his friend from CalArts Henry Selick to direct the film, and he agreed.
Fun fact, this movie was inspired by a poem that Tim Burton wrote back in 1982 while he was still working as an animator at Walt Disney Productions. And in my opinion, when I read this poem at my local Barnes & Nobles, I find it to be very inspirational. Also, I really love how it took inspiration from a few TV specials like Rankin Bass's Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Chuck Jones' How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and the legendary poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, aka The Night Before Christmas.
You're not the only one, Joshua, because I always love that too. I mean, the title alone speaks for itself, right? And the Rudolph reference, I always love that too. And it took a little while, but I did finally realize that the Grinch was part of the inspiration, mostly due to an interview that he did during one of the anniversaries of the TV special.
I remember when Tim Burton mentioned these classic Christmas stories in an interview during the behind the scenes of the film, which I highly recommend you to check it out.
As for the sets, well, I think Halloween Town looks not only spooky, but also really amazing, especially with all the different kinds of creatures who can be pretty scary, but not evil, for the fun and the celebration of Halloween. And I think the way they do Christmas in their own creepy and twisted way is very creative, despite the toys and decorations becoming hostile when Jack delivers them.
And this is one of the things that sets this movie apart from so many others, is the sets. They are absolutely perfect. Because just like you, Joshua, I love how everything's set up. It is flawless. It really is. I haven't found any problems with the sets or with the characters or anything. They're all amazing in their own way. And what I love about this is, even though a lot of the monsters do kind of follow the similar pattern of like vampires, werewolves, that sort of thing, they're not rip-offs of classic movies like Dracula or the Wolfman or anything. They are their own creatures. And that really sets it apart.
I love the stop-motion animation in this movie. The sets are incredible. I love the look of Halloween Town, not just for the use of German expressionism, but also the color settings are fitting with the use of black, white, gray, green, and orange. I also love the character designs. They are very well detailed, and it stayed true to Tim Burton's drawings, including from the book he made.
Plus, I think Christmas Town looks very magical and festive, with elves, toys, snowman, and Santa Claus himself.
I agree. Christmas Town does look magical, especially that it's so colorful.
Plus, I think the songs for this movie are absolutely timeless, like This Is Halloween, What's This, and Kidnap the Sandy Claus.
And let's not forget the Oogie Boogie song. I love that song. That is probably my favorite in this whole picture. I love Oogie Boogie singing it with that Cajun accent of his. And he makes it very clear that he's going to do away with Santa Claus big time.
Looks like the villains, mostly the ones from Disney, always gets the catchy songs. And this is one of them. And I say that Ken Page did a spot-on job voicing the character of Oogie Boogie. Also to let you know that on September 30th of 2024, Ken Page passed away at the age of 70. It's too bad that we lost him because he'll always be remembered as the voice of one of the best Disney villains ever.
As for the characters, well, I think Jack Skellington is a very sympathetic character, and he kind of reminds me of me whenever I have to go through some tiresome annual events like Mother's Day, birthdays, Christmas, or other things like that.
Yeah, the holidays can be stressful. No doubt about that one.
For me, I say that Jack Skellington is one of the best characters. And while I enjoy Chris Sarandon's performance as the speaking voice of the character, I say that Danny Elfman did a fantastic job as the singing voice of Jack, while he also did the music and songs for the movie, which, by the way, it is one of the absolute best, and I enjoy every minute of it. Also, the rest of the cast are really good in their roles, such as Catherine O'Hara, Paul Reubens, Glenn Shadax, and a few others. Also to let you know that here's an interesting fact. Jack Skellington also made a cameo as a skeleton pirate captain during the underwater scene in Henry Selick's film adaptation of James and the Giant Peach. Very interesting, am I right?
His love interest, Sally, does make a good voice of reason, and I think she and Jack make a nice couple together. Zero is a cute ghost dog, And I like that he leads Jack's sleigh and skeletal reindeer team on Christmas Eve. Lock, Shock, and Barrel, aka the Halloween Town Crusaders, are pretty much three mischievous little pranksters, and their boss, Oogie Boogie, despite having a small role and not a very clear villainous motivation, is still a great Disney villain. And speaking of which, here's a scary fact. During the Oogie Boogie song, they used ultraviolet lights to create that cool lighting effect, which is kind of similar to the lights used during Jacob Marley's song in Musical Theater Village's production of A Christmas with Scrooge. However, director Henry Selick had to be really careful to avoid getting a skin disease from those type of lights. Now that, my friends, is pretty scary, don't you think?
It sure is. And I'm sorry that he had to really watch it on that one, because the man loves what he does. And he put his heart and his work into the stop motion animation on this.
I definitely agree. And I gotta say that Henry Selick did a great job directing this film.
Plus, over the years, The Nightmare Before Christmas has gained a large cult following. It influenced a few video games like The Nightmare Before Christmas Oogie's Revenge and a level in the Kingdom Hearts series. It influenced a seasonal overlay at Disneyland called the Haunted Mansion Holiday, which has been going on every Halloween and Christmas seasons ever since 2001.
Not to mention, during Halloween as well as Christmas, you can find Nightmare Before Christmas stuff everywhere. You can find them at Spencer's, Walmart, you name it.
Not only that there are tons of merchandise and all of that stuff, but also concerts, and there are times that you get to see the film in theaters in eye-popping 3D. And also, you can watch The Nightmare Before Christmas 3D on DVD and Blu-ray.
The last thing that I want to mention regarding this masterpiece is just last year, The Nightmare Before Christmas was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry by the Library of Congress for being culturally, historically, or authentically significant. Movie fan, Jonathan, do you guys have anything else to say regarding this movie?
Well, for starters, that was rightfully earned. It deserves a place in the Library of Congress for more ways than you can imagine. For instance, everything that you said, Joshua, that's plenty good reason enough. But there's actually a bit more to it that most people never think about. And that would be this. When this movie came around, unfortunately stop motion animation was dying. Because, well, back in the 70s, Star Wars came out, and, well, sadly, because of that, stop motion fell out of favor. And then, of course, in 1993, Jurassic Park came out, and as we all know, that was made with a combination of animatronics and CGI. And, of course, all the younger generations, myself included at the time, were blown away by all that. And that would have been the nail in the coffin for stop motion if it wasn't for The Nightmare Before Christmas, because in October 1993, it premiered, and everybody was blown away by that, because the characters were lovable, the stop motion was perfect, everybody just fell in love with stop motion animation all over again.
I agree, and let's face it, it became a critical and commercial success when it was released. Also to let you know that the film was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Special Effects, only to be beaten by Steven Spielberg's famous dinosaur movie Jurassic Park. But like other films like Beetlejuice, Batman, and Edward Scissorhands, The Nightmare Before Christmas became one of Tim Burton's most popular movies. And when I said that Corpse Bride is one of the 2 Tim Burton anime films that I hope that someday will be turned into a Broadway stage musical, well, The Nightmare Before Christmas is the other one, and I hope that it will happen. If it will happen, I say that not only that Danny Elfman should do the music and songs for it, but also it should be directed by Julie Taymor, while doing the costumes and puppets just like she did for the Broadway stage musical of Disney's The Lion King. Now you might ask me this big question. Is it a Halloween movie or a Christmas movie? Well, for me, I say that this movie is worth watching for both Halloween and Christmas. So with all that said, if you haven't seen The Nightmare Before Christmas, check it out. You'll love it. And we promise you that you'll feel like watching it on both Halloween and Christmas, because it's worth watching on both holidays.
The Nightmare Before Christmas, a stop-motion masterpiece where two holidays come together, and the #1 Tim Burton film of all time. Well, that about wraps it up for the top 13 Tim Burton films. You know, this list was a really big challenge, and I'm really glad that we did it. Plus, I find it pretty funny that we put this list together during this time of year, not only because of the recent release of the Beetlejuice sequel, but because just recently, on September 3rd, 2024, Tim Burton got a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and that to me makes me extremely proud of the macabre visionary genius. And I really hope he gives us more freaky, weird, dark, and creative films in the future, whether being live action or stop motion.
I hope so too. But knowing Tim Burton, I'm sure he's got something cooking.
I'm so glad that we did this top 13 list together. And not only that I'm proud that Tim Burton got a star in the Hollywood Walk of Fame, but while I'm looking forward to see what he has in store for season 2 of the Netflix series Wednesday, I'm also looking forward to see what he's gonna do next. Maybe a collaboration with some of my favorite directors like Ari Aster, Guillermo del Toro, James Wan, Michael Dougherty, or Jennifer Kent.
Well, anyway, that's all for now. I'd like to thank the movie fan and Jonathan Cohen, the reviewer, for helping me make this list possible.
Well, I'm glad to have been a part of it. Thanks for inviting me, Joshua. Hopefully we can do something more like this again.
You're welcome, Joshua. Originally, I wanted to do this on my channel years ago, but I'm glad that we did it together. And I would like to thank you and Movie Fan for inviting me to do this with you guys. And I'm glad I get the opportunity to do it. I'm also looking forward to do more team-ups in the future.
This is Movie Fan, signing off.
This is Jonathan the Reviewer, and I'll see you in my channel.
Take care, guys. And as for the rest of you, be sure to join me for my next blog. Mustang Power.